In this episode, we focus on a part of security that seems administrative at first, but quickly becomes one of the clearest ways an organization either protects itself wisely or creates avoidable exposure through everyday decisions. New learners often think access risk begins when someone steals a password or when an attacker breaks into a system, yet many access problems begin much earlier than that. They begin when the organization fails to define identity clearly, fails to understand what a role actually requires, and then starts granting access before those foundations are in place. Once that happens, the business may look organized on the surface while quietly building confusion, excess privilege, poor accountability, and opportunities for misuse that did not need to exist. That is why this topic matters so much at the beginner level. If you understand how identity and role definition shape access before provisioning ever takes place, you gain a much stronger way to think about trust, least privilege, and the everyday decisions that determine whether the right people receive the right access for the right reasons. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is with identity itself, because organizations often use the word casually even though it carries a very specific security meaning. In a security context, identity is the way a person, system, service, or device is recognized as a distinct entity inside the environment. That recognition matters because access decisions depend on knowing who or what is requesting the access and how that requester fits into business operations. A beginner may think of identity only as a username or account, but that is too narrow. A real security view of identity includes the relationship between a person and the digital representation used to grant access, log activity, assign responsibility, and support later review. If identities are unclear, duplicated, shared, poorly named, or loosely tied to real people and roles, the organization begins building access on top of uncertainty. That is a serious problem because the whole access model depends on knowing who belongs where, what that identity represents, and how the organization can manage that identity responsibly over time. Once identity is clearer, the next major question is role, and this is where many organizations either gain control or create long-term confusion without realizing it at first. A role is not simply a job title copied from a business card or a vague label attached to a department. In security thinking, a role describes the kind of work a person performs, the responsibilities attached to that work, and the access that is legitimately needed to perform those responsibilities. That difference matters because two people may share a broad title while still needing different levels or kinds of access based on the tasks they actually perform. A beginner should think of role as a security translation of real business function. It connects the work people do to the access they need, and it does so in a way that helps the organization stay disciplined instead of granting permissions based on convenience, assumption, or pressure. Without clear roles, access decisions become much more likely to drift toward excess because no one has a stable standard for what is actually necessary. This is why defining roles before provisioning is so important. Provisioning is the act of creating, assigning, or enabling access for a user so that person can perform work inside systems and services. If provisioning happens before roles are defined clearly, the organization begins granting access based on guesses, past habits, copied permissions, or whatever seems easiest in the moment. That may feel efficient at first, especially in busy environments where people want new hires productive immediately, but it creates access risk because the permissions are not being shaped by a well-understood business need. Instead, they are being shaped by speed, inconsistency, or personal preference. Beginners should hear this as a major warning sign. Access that starts from convenience instead of clear role definition often becomes too broad, too hard to review later, and too difficult to defend when someone asks why a user was given a certain level of privilege in the first place. Strong provisioning begins after identity and role clarity, not before it. One of the clearest principles underneath this topic is least privilege. Least privilege means a user should receive only the access necessary to perform legitimate duties and no more. This sounds simple when stated as a principle, but it becomes much harder to achieve when identities are vague and roles are poorly defined. If the organization cannot clearly explain what a role requires, then it cannot confidently say what minimum access is appropriate for that role. That uncertainty often leads to one of two bad outcomes. Either the user receives more access than needed because no one wants to risk slowing the work, or the user receives a random set of permissions that must be patched repeatedly over time, which creates confusion and inconsistency. For beginners, this is one of the most practical reasons to define roles early. Clear roles give least privilege a real foundation. Without them, least privilege remains a good-sounding idea that is hard to apply because the organization never established the boundaries that show what access is enough and what access is already too much. Another reason role definition matters so much is accountability. When access is tied to a clearly defined identity and a clearly defined role, it becomes much easier to explain who should have access, why that access exists, and what kind of activity would be normal or unusual for that user. When roles are muddy, accountability weakens because there is no stable expectation against which decisions and behavior can be judged. A person may be given access because someone said they might need it, or because another employee in a different context had similar permissions, or because no one wanted to revisit an old setup. Later, if questions arise about misuse, excessive exposure, or improper access, the organization struggles to explain the original basis for the decision. For a beginner, that is a very important lesson. Access control is not only about blocking bad actors. It is also about making access decisions understandable, traceable, and reviewable. That becomes far more difficult when provisioning begins before the organization has taken the time to define who the user is in business terms and what the role genuinely requires. It also helps to understand that role definition is not just a technical security task. It is a business understanding task that security helps translate into access rules. The people closest to the work usually understand what tasks a role performs, what systems support those tasks, what approvals are needed, and where separation between duties should exist. Security then helps turn that business understanding into structured access decisions that reduce risk and improve consistency. Beginners sometimes assume the technical team can solve access design alone, but that often leads to poor results because technology can enforce only what has been defined meaningfully first. If the business cannot explain what a role needs and what it should not need, then technical controls may end up protecting a bad design rather than creating a good one. That is why access planning is strongest when role definition is rooted in real work. The closer the access design stays to actual business responsibility, the easier it becomes to support least privilege, review permissions, and avoid granting broad access simply because the organization never translated the role carefully enough. A common mistake in organizations is role explosion, where access models become cluttered with too many overlapping, inconsistent, or poorly differentiated roles. This often happens when access is granted piecemeal over time without a disciplined effort to define stable role patterns first. One employee gets a special exception, another inherits permissions from a predecessor, another changes teams but keeps old access, and soon the organization has a tangle of roles and permission sets that no one fully understands. At that point, provisioning becomes more dangerous because it is easier to copy a messy access profile than to step back and ask what the role should actually require. Beginners should see this as a warning about unmanaged growth. A messy role structure makes every later access decision weaker because the organization is no longer provisioning from clarity. It is provisioning from history, habit, and accumulated exceptions. Stronger security begins earlier by keeping roles meaningful, limited, and connected to real job function, so that provisioning remains a deliberate decision rather than a copy of old confusion. Separation of duties also belongs in this conversation because defining roles properly is one of the best ways to prevent one person from receiving too much power over a sensitive process. Some activities should not be fully controlled from beginning to end by a single individual, especially when money, approvals, sensitive records, or important changes are involved. If roles are defined carelessly, provisioning may accidentally combine privileges that allow a user to request, approve, and complete the same action without independent review. That is a serious access risk because it makes fraud, abuse, and hidden mistakes easier to carry out. For beginners, this is an important reminder that good role definition is not only about making work possible. It is also about making risky combinations less likely. A well-defined role supports the business while respecting the fact that some powers should remain divided. When provisioning happens before that thought process occurs, organizations often discover too late that they built convenience into a process that actually required stronger checks and better separation. Another major risk appears when organizations treat access as permanent rather than as something that should follow the life cycle of the user and the role. A person joins the organization, changes teams, takes on temporary work, covers a project, receives a special exception, or leaves the company entirely. If identity and role were not defined properly at the start, these later changes become much harder to manage because the original access was already unclear. That means reviews are weaker, removals are slower, and old privileges can linger long after their business purpose has disappeared. Beginners should understand that provisioning is not a single moment. It sits inside a larger life cycle of joiner, mover, and leaver activity, and that life cycle only works well when identities and roles were meaningful from the beginning. Clear role-based access is easier to review, easier to adjust, and easier to remove when the user's business function changes. Poorly defined access, on the other hand, becomes sticky. It remains attached because no one is quite sure what it was for in the first place, which increases exposure every day it remains unresolved. This is why approvals matter so much in the provisioning process. Approval should not be a rubber stamp or a casual email reply from someone who assumes the request looks familiar. A meaningful approval confirms that the identity is correct, the role is understood, the access requested fits that role, and any elevated or unusual permissions have a clear business basis. If the organization skips careful role definition, approvals lose much of their value because the approver may be validating a request without a strong framework for judging whether it makes sense. For beginners, this is a powerful insight because it shows that approvals are only as good as the clarity behind them. A manager can approve broad access very quickly, but that speed does not make the decision safe if no one first established what the role actually requires. Strong provisioning uses approval as a checkpoint grounded in role logic, not as an administrative step added after the access decision has already been made informally. Documentation supports this whole process by giving the organization a durable record of what identity was created, what role it was tied to, what access was granted, who approved it, and why the decision made sense at that time. This is not about creating paperwork for its own sake. It is about making access understandable enough that future reviewers can check whether it still matches the user's responsibilities. Without that record, reviews become guesswork and cleanup becomes much harder. A beginner should think of documentation as memory for the access model. It helps the organization remember the basis of its decisions after people change roles, managers leave, or teams reorganize. That becomes especially valuable when something looks wrong later. If a user appears to have excessive privileges, a documented role-based decision trail can help show whether the access was approved deliberately, inherited carelessly, or never really justified at all. When provisioning decisions lack that clarity, the organization ends up relying on assumptions and partial recollections, which weakens both governance and security. There is also an important human side to this topic, because access pressure often comes from urgency. A new employee needs to start quickly, a contractor needs a tool right away, a project is already late, or a manager insists that broad access is easier than waiting for a more careful review. These pressures are real, and beginners should not assume they happen only in badly run organizations. They happen in many environments because people are trying to get work done. The problem is that speed can quietly become the reason good access discipline is abandoned. Once that happens, the organization begins trading long-term security and clean accountability for short-term convenience. Good governance resists that trade when the risk is too high. It does not refuse all urgency, but it makes sure urgency does not erase the basic questions of identity, role, business need, and minimum necessary access. Beginners who understand this early will be much better prepared to recognize that access risk is often created by ordinary pressure and poor process, not just by technical failure. Scenario-based questions and real workplace situations become easier when you train yourself to ask a few grounding questions. Who is this identity supposed to represent? What work does this role actually perform? What minimum access is needed for that work? What access would be unnecessary or risky? Who should approve it? And how will it be reviewed later? These questions help because they slow down the careless instinct to grant first and explain later. They turn provisioning into a thought process rather than a quick administrative act. For a beginner, that is one of the biggest takeaways from this episode. Many access problems are not mysterious at all once you realize the organization skipped the early steps of understanding identity and role. If those early steps are strong, provisioning becomes more consistent, reviews become more meaningful, and excessive access becomes easier to prevent. If those steps are weak, the organization starts building exposure into the access model from the very beginning, and later controls have to work much harder to clean up what should have been designed better in the first place. As we close, remember that provisioning decisions create access risk when they happen before identities and roles are clearly defined. Identity matters because access must be tied to a real, accountable entity rather than a vague or shared digital presence. Role matters because access should follow actual business responsibility, not assumption, convenience, or copied history. Once those two pieces are clear, least privilege, separation of duties, approvals, documentation, and lifecycle review become much easier to apply in a disciplined way. Without that foundation, access tends to spread too widely, remain too long, and become too hard to explain when questions arise. That is why this topic belongs near the center of foundational security thinking. It shows that access risk often begins long before misuse occurs. It begins when the organization decides who someone is, what that person truly needs to do, and whether access will be granted from a place of clarity or from a place of hurry and uncertainty. Strong security starts by getting those early decisions right.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.